Good afternoon, everybody. You're going to have to excuse the frogs that have set up shop in my throat. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I direct the Humanities Forum. Welcome to a special Thursday afternoon edition of said forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities program, giving you the chance to hear from scholars, writers, artists, authors from around the country and around the world, to ask the big questions that animate their work, to share their research with you, and ultimately to deepen your love and appreciation of the humanities. In a minute, I'll introduce my guest, our guest, just to lay down the ground rules first, in case you don't know. One ground rule is no screens, and it looks like you guys are doing an A+ job of that, so good work. Another rule is, so the way it's structured is, we'll be talking for about the first 45 minutes or so, and you would have to pry this microphone out of my hand, but thereafter, it's open season. Student has to ask the first question. So we'll have about 30 minutes for audience Q&A at the end. And then at 5:45, the third rule is go to the great room and have some conviviality, snacks, etc. Got a nice setup in there. We hope you join us. Okay. So, today's guest is Sister Maria Frassati Jakupcak. She is a member of the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist. She's also an assistant professor of English and a core fellow at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Sister Maria got her MA and her PhD at the Catholic University of America, where she wrote on player-dramatists present in William Shakespeare's plays. She's also regularly published articles on Tolkien, Belloc, Rumer Godden, and her writing regularly appears in Magnificat and also at Deep Down Things. Now, that's the sort of like broad official bio, but you and I both know that if you want to get the straight scoop on what somebody's really like, you have to go to Rate My Professor. And so I did that. And she has one rating, but it's a rare one because ordinarily there's an inverse relation between difficulty and how much they like that person. But in her case, it said, and I quote, "Hilarious, and made a boring subject like liberal learning actually fun." However, she has no mercy on grading and will not respond to email questions regarding questions on grading. Great teacher, though. So please, knowing that she's not going to take any nonsense, but she's going to make a boring subject like liberal learning fun, please give a warm Providence College welcome to Sister Maria Frassati.
That's so funny. I just have that one rating, but you found it, so good job.
You know, and leave no stone unturned. Were you, so you are an English professor and a Dominican sister. Correct. Which one of those came first?
Dominican sister. So I entered the Dominicans when I was 18, actually. So I did all of my education from zero to doctorate, like in community. So I was certified first, after my first vows for teaching elementary education, and was doing that. And then Mother called me and was like, I'd been in a summer program at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, Purple UST, as we call it, at Red UST. And she said, well, I just want you to know that you're not going to go study this summer. She's Southern, by the way. I just knew you'd be crushed. And I was like, oh, okay, Mother. She's like, well, I'm going to send you to study full time. And I was like, at St. Thomas? And she was like, no. Full stop. She didn't tell me what I was doing. And I was like, oh, okay. Thanks, Mother. And then I thought about it, and I was like, I bet I'm going to do English at CUA, because I knew President Garvey had been talking to us, and the community had been saying English to me for a while, and then that's what it was. So I got sent there to get a master's, and then the people at CUA were like, where are you going? Stay as a teaching fellow. And I was like, I got to call some people before I do that. So anyway, that's what happened.
Did you find it, was it an acquired taste?
No, actually, this is the best. So I'm from a science family. My mom is a medical doctor, and my dad is a geologist and taught high school geology, rocks or jocks, as he called it. But in any case, I would have studied science in college if I had chosen myself, pre-convent, and I would have enjoyed it, because we're a science family, and that's what we talk about all the time. But all of us read books for fun, and so I got to grad school, and I was like, these 8 novels are my books for school. Like, I've been reading these for fun in my spare time, and this could be my job. Like, why didn't anybody tell me this? Like, this is a thing people do, so it wasn't an acquired taste at all. I had already acquired the taste.
Was Tolkien one of your favorites when you were growing up?
Oh, yes. So here's the thing that I find is difficult talking about Tolkien whenever you do is that there's always somebody in the room who's like, actually, I speak Elvish. You know what I mean? And so I'm like, I just don't have patience for you thinking you can out Tolkien nerd me. Okay, so if you could go to my next slide here, this is like really a very important slide. The year is 1972. My parents got married. My mom was the youngest. My grandparents sold their house, bought a mini home, and named it The Hobbit. And they like gave out copies of The Hobbit like they were Hobbit evangelists, okay? So my sister and I were actually named for characters from The Lord of the Rings. So the Tolkien nerddom is like 3 generations deep, and I win. Like, I don't speak Elvish, but like, anyway, you just need to establish your Tolkien nerddom credibility, I find. So thus.
That's hard to beat.
Yeah.
Why do you think that, so was The Hobbit more prevalent in your family than Lord of the Rings? Was this the sort of text?
I think maybe for my grandparents, yes. 72, that's like, Lord of the Rings is still pretty new, right? And so it was just an easier, more accessible text for them. But Mom definitely like read The Lord of the Rings out loud to my sister and I, like when we were quite small. And she's the kind of Tolkien nerd then, my mom, who's like, well, actually, Legolas shouldn't have blonde hair because the Sindarian elves, like, she just gives this whole thing. You're like, oh, wow, Mom, okay. Like, actually, nobody cares but you. Like, he looks too much like Orlando Bloom with black hair. You know what I mean? Like, so.
So you're not a Tolkien purist like that?
I am not. I know that's a contentious thing, and that Tolkien's, like, estate and family and things, like, have very strong opinions about all things Tolkien adaptation, but I thought the movies were good, and I thought more people read the books as a result of them. So,
it seems like in general, young people struggle with reading nowadays, right?
Yes.
We don't want to be like old man shaking our fists at the clouds, right?
Right.
But it seems like an ongoing decline. That's what it feels like. And yet it seems like it's also true that a great many young people are still getting into Lord of the Rings. I know a lot of people here today are interested in Lord of the Rings. Do you have thoughts on why the Lord of the Rings has such a sort of tenacious staying power, even in a time when it seems like reading on the whole is on the decline?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's just a dang good story, right? Like, there's something about that kind of story arc of the unknown little guy who saves the day, that is a sort of repeated trope in a lot of things. I'm just thinking, we had a talk once at the Mother House where someone mentioned Frodo, and then in the next breath, it was also the girl version is like, and you're a princess, and Julie Andrews is your grandmother, you know what I mean, like that. But that kind of exaltation of the humble sort of vibe, I think, is something beautiful. I think the characters are awesome. I think the sort of sweep of the whole thing is also beautifully balanced, etc. So I think there's something gripping about that kind of story where, like, somebody little, like a hobbit, who's, I hate the word relatable, but relatable, we can relate to him, who ends up having to do this hard thing that is difficult, but he perseveres. And I just think it's a beautiful story, basically.
It's also an impressive example of world building, right?
Yes. I mean, I was just saying today, Tolkien kind of invented world building as we conceive of it in the modern time. So my first article I wrote was on Lewis and Tolkien. And you may or may not know that they sort of fell out later in their life, that they ended up being not as such close friends as they were. And there's a lot of different explanations for how that happened and why that was. And usually it's framed as though Tolkien was just kind of a jerk and he didn't like Lewis's American divorcee wife. That's kind of the usual way that people talk about it. But I actually think that they had some kind of strong differences in the way that they conceived of imaginative worlds, or like they had different ideas about the imagination, that I think is at least part of the explanation. So Lewis is into, like if you think of Narnia, he's into just like throwing things into it, like Father Christmas is there, and the Greek goddesses are there. It's like, it just sort of like whatever he like wanted to put in Narnia just arrived in Narnia. And Tolkien is like so planned and purposeful, and like how deep the legendarium goes, really. So fun fact about how The Lord of the Rings got written is it began actually in the trenches of World War I, where Tolkien, who was a philology student, was writing Elvish languages to keep himself sane. Now that doesn't sound like a thing that most of us would do, but like if you're a philology student, I guess that makes sense. Okay, so in a time when you're just trying to hang on to your scraps of humanity, right? Like what he would do to keep his mind occupied during like bombardments was write these Elvish languages, and then he got interested himself in how he had two Elvish languages and like, well, how did this one derive from that one? So then he needed a story of how the elves traveled from A to B, and like that's kind of how the Silmarillion began. And so like he was writing that stuff, and that was the stuff he really desired to write. Insofar as he wanted to write stories about it at all, he was just doing that for fun in his spare time. And so it gave the world that he built this like really sort of fundamental coherence that I think Narnia didn't have, I guess, if that makes sense.
That's super interesting, especially because I didn't know that about the genesis of. So the really he's conceptualizing the Silmarillion before The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or anything.
Yes.
Like that, right? Because if you just look at the chronology, you'd think, well, he made up this nice little story called The Hobbit, and then sort of worked his way into a bigger world from there. But that's not the case.
No, that's not the case at all. So he'd been writing the Silmarillion sort of, again, in the background of his life. And then one day, it's a very famous story of how he began to write The Hobbit, that he was grading exams, like national exams, which are quite boring. Grading exams, so boring. Like grading written exams, like even more boring. And so
he... be grateful she gave you a grade at all, right?
That's right, yeah, that's right. Listen. And so he flipped one of them over, and he just had the inspiration to write the line, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And he was like, what's a hobbit? You know? And so he just sort of followed that train of imagination, and it ended up picking up a few of the things from his like Silmarillion world. And there's famously the chapter with Gollum is like revised after he wrote The Lord of the Rings. But basically, so then he was like, Allen and Unwin end up publishing The Hobbit, and then they're like, give us a Hobbit sequel. And he's like, do you want this like huge legendarium about the creation of everything? They were like, no, we just don't. And so The Lord of the Rings sort of met those two things halfway. And when you read it, right, it reads the beginning is a sequel to The Hobbit. And he got the hobbits to Bree, and he saw Strider, and then he's like, what am I doing? Strider's name, by the way, was Trotter through all the drafts almost until the very end.
With an O? With
Trotter, Trotter. Which I just think is horrible. So good job for changing. Good job having him change it, you know. So that was when he sort of realized, whoa, this is like part of my like bigger world that's already built in this meaningful way that's going to give this coherence to this whole story that I'm writing. And then it was through kind of the correspondence with his son, who was abroad serving in the military, and with the Inklings that he really was driven to finish the thing, because I don't think he would have otherwise.
Somebody was telling me, and this might have been you when we were talking a month or so ago, that part of what opened up the world of The Lord of the Rings was he got as far as when they're supposed to meet Gandalf at
Bree.
Thank you, Bree, and Gandalf doesn't arrive.
Right.
And then Tolkien is like, why wouldn't Gandalf arrive?
Yeah, like,
something
why didn't he
serious
come?
Must be going on.
It's interesting the way he talks about his creative process was almost as though someone else had written this book that he's writing. Like his experience of reading it was like or writing it was almost as something received, he said, kind of by him. So.
Or like a discovery.
Yeah.
As well, right?
Yes.
So, because I was thinking, like, I think one of the things that's charming about The Hobbit is it's such a sort of modest, localized tale, right? In terms of like if you're building into this massive world that you've cooked up.
Right. Yeah, and I think hobbits, it really maybe I should put it this way, maybe not Lord of the Rings so much as hobbits are kind of the thing that brought the thing together, right? Like once he created those as unbeknownst to himself, like them existing sort of on the margins of this world that he'd been creating already, that was kind of what gave the impetus to the Lord of the Rings story, that where you can have this exaltation of the humble, where they can participate in this huge society. He's also so true to his own principles. I like to say that if you talk to me for 10 minutes, I will think of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. If you talk to me for 15, I will mention it because I just think about it all the time.
We've been going for 15 minutes.
I know, all the time. So in on fairy stories, he talks about the importance of how fantasy is written and the importance of secondary belief, which is slightly for him different than the willing suspension of disbelief. Does that phrase ring any bells to anyone? Willing suspension of disbelief. Okay, so this is a thing that Coleridge said in an essay that was a preface to a thing. Okay, where he says that this is what we're doing when we read literature. We're willingly suspending our disbelief. So meaning that like I sit down to watch a Marvel movie and I'm like condescending to believe that there is that Iron Man exists. Right? I know he doesn't, but we're just gonna play this game of make believe.
Is it condescending though, or?
This is what Tolkien would think. Tolkien thinks it's condescending, and so then that's the way Coleridge says fiction works, and we're like, yeah, it feels like that feels true, and Tolkien is like, not good enough. That is not good enough, and he thinks that, well, and he wouldn't use Marvel movies as an example. Because he doesn't think that movies can do it in the same way that books can, which is important. But so he thinks that a good story creates secondary belief, meaning that you know that it's not real, but you're sort of on the edge of like, is it though real? So think of something like, Homer does this. Why have you never seen a Cyclops? Well, Homer tells you. They live on an island. They don't build boats. So of course have you ever sailed to the Cyclops Island? That's the only way you could see one. So you could still live in a world in which there are Cyclopses that you've never seen. Why have you never seen the gods? Well, they cover you with mist, So that's all stuff that like, oh, they could be out there and I just didn't know. So when you read the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, it's like this anthropological study of what a hobbit is and where they live and what they're doing and how they don't like big people and they're not common anymore. And all of that is in the service of creating secondary belief, right? Where you're like, wait, there's not hobbits, right? Like, are there hobbits? Like, so that's kind of, I think, what he's going after, what he thinks the best kinds of stories could do, which Narnia is so fun, but it doesn't do that, right?
I was just going to ask you, is that why it would beef with the way Lewis builds his worlds?
Yeah, and also Lewis is just like, and then you get to the last battle and you're like, unicorns! Never had a unicorn in one of the books. He just like throws them in there at the end. You're like, wait, have they been there this whole time? No, he just thought of it right now and he threw them in there at the end, So Tolkien just, if we're going to use, and I did this in the article, but an analogy of what that looks like, Lewis is like Gothic architecture. There is an overarching plan, but there's all the gargoyles are different, and they're all just sort of shoved in there anyhow, and it's like, and each artist kind of gets to have the free play of his imagination. That's a famous Ruskin essay. So contrary-wise, Tolkien is like building the Pantheon, where every little piece is subservient to the overarching design, right? And so I just think they have this kind of different architecture of the imagination, as it were.
Do you think there's any sort of important salience in the distinction between willing suspension of disbelief and secondary belief, or is it just important insofar as it leads Tolkien to build his worlds in a certain way?
It's certainly interesting. Like, I don't know if I agree with him fully. That's a good question. It is part of why he has beef with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare generally, and drama sort of more broadly, except for Peter Pan, which is so perverse. He really liked Peter Pan. And like it would be one thing if he just hated all drama, but he didn't. He really liked Peter Pan. I can't explain it. I don't think he could either. But I'm not sure. I do think that there might be something different about it, though. I've been thinking, as we talked about, of like a different kind of distinction about the sort of things that stories are written to do, or whether or not they're written to do something. We're not currently making this distinction in English circles, but I just think it could be useful to distinguish between narrative, which right now we talk about narratives, building narratives, narrative construction of things, as in political terms or advertising terms, in all things that are calculated to produce an effect, a specific effect, and you judge the effectiveness of the narrative on if it produces said effect, right? Tolkien would call that magical. There's a part in On Fairy Stories when he talks about magic versus what he calls enchantment. And enchantment, or what I would say maybe we could call that story instead of narrative, is not about exercising a force on the primary world to change it, to get you to buy something, or to get you to do something. But enchantment is, he says, purely artistic in purpose. And so stories in the same way, perhaps things that are written just to create the secondary belief, the secondary world, Tolkien's going to say that the author and the reader kind of both are in and can enter and sort of mutually create, which is why I'm a little bit more, I think, free with my, like Legolas can be blonde, you know, if you want, that there's a sort of give and take because they're all sort of part of the same cosmos, I guess. In a way that, like, Dante in Inferno 11 calls art God's grandchild, which I think is quite closely related to how Tolkien speaks of sub-creation, right? So sub-creation, secondary belief, is sort of a different thing because you're acting within the cosmos that we're all part of and making this, like, little sub-world that's, like, subservient to the big world, as opposed to narrative, which potentially is related to that sort of maybe condescending, willing suspension of disbelief, where I'm separate and trying to act on you in a different way. And that's not very well articulated, but
the way that you're talking about narrative is how it gets tossed around on, say, like culture war things or politics, or like what's the narrative around the campaign, or, you know, well, it's a problematic narrative.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. And given that we're already using the word that way, I'm like, well, let's just use that word to mean that thing. And then, like, we could just use story to mean this other thing. I mean, he's got the magic enchantment dichotomy already there, but I think enchantment is like a word that feels like it has Dungeons and Dragons baggage or something. You know what I mean? It feels like it just has other baggage.
Also, like, narrative sounds so much more sophisticated than stories, right? Like, I'm sure when I was in grad school, I'd be like, no, I'm not going to talk about stories. Those are for kids. I'm going to talk about
narrative. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What about, just to come back to Lewis and Tolkien again, and the illuminating differences between them. Does allegory play into this and their uses of allegory? Because it seems like, if I'm extending what you're saying, it seems like one of Lewis's interests, you know, saying like the Lion, the Witch, Wardrobe, is like, I'm going to reanimate the crucifixion resurrection story for you so that you see it freshly.
Yes. Whereas
Tolkien, I can't imagine, would have any interest in an allegorical dimension.
Lewis said he didn't. I mean, we got a Lewis specialist in the room, but he's like, no, I'm not doing allegory. And I just think he's wrong. I told Holly Ordway that, and she was like, no, sister, you're wrong. I'm like, oh, I just think, it's like, I'm like not saying this lightly, C.S. Lewis, you're wrong about what your own thing. But like, if Aslan doesn't equal Jesus, like Aslan equals Jesus, the end. Like I just don't, like, I don't think there's any other way to read that. So Tolkien pushed back famously in the preface to Lord of the Rings against an allegorical reading of it because people were like, and this guy is Hitler, and this is the Second World War. And he's like, it's just not like what I'm doing, everyone. And so yeah, he would resist that kind of making new. So also on fairy stories, he says that what fairy stories do, it's not that they don't do things, because I said narratives do things, right? But they create recovery, escape, consolation. So recovery, I think, is maybe what Lewis was doing with putting Jesus in another land and making him a lion, right? Anyway, no, I'm gonna not go down the lion tangent. I just almost went down. Okay, so that, and so it sort of gives us this refreshed view of like what the crucifixion is. Tolkien talks about, there's a Chesterton essay where Chesterton talks about the word moriphok and how it's this like weird, super strange word that you're looking at and it's like foreign and whatever, and then like you realize it's just the word coffee room backwards and you're inside the shop looking at it. And so I think almost it's like Aslan is sort of the moriphok, right? Like he gives us this like refreshed view of the crucifixion. But for Tolkien, like it needs to be more. Like and he says that like a good story is going to not just do that for one thing in your life, but like your whole life. And he says everything that you thought you knew is going to be like released from its jewel hoard and like fly away, kind of is almost the verbiage that he uses. Of like there should be something that's like sort of remaking fundamentally to your like entire way of seeing everything, as opposed to just your way of seeing this one thing. So I think allegory has the power to just refresh like one thing at a time. But the thing about the Lord of the Rings is you like deeply kind of enter into it, and then you come back to the real world, you know, with this sort of refreshed view of the way you see all of it and the dignity of all things. So I think that is. Like one of why he didn't like allegory, if I can put it that way.
I like that. Hold on. This was my next thought. So, you know, you mentioned that he builds this whole world, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember being like 14 and reading the Silmarillion, and it's like it encourages you to sort of become a Tolkien scholar, because you're like, aha, now I really understand the backstory of Sauron and what exactly. At what point did you start to think about studying Tolkien? Because I think when you were in grad school, you know, according to my notes, you did Shakespeare, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would have done Tolkien if there'd been our guy who would have directed that dissertation at Catholic, Virgil Nemoyanu, who's recently died, but was like retiring at the time, and it just seemed like was he going to live long enough, basically, for me to finish my dissertation? And then my director...
Powerful incentive to finish.
Right, yeah. Indeed, yes. That maybe I would have finished faster. Also, Virgil, gosh, he was out of my league. You know what I mean? Like, working with him, he was way too smart for me. And I think he knew it, even though he helped me get into the doctoral program. So the guy who recruited me to stay for the doctoral program, Michael Mack, was a Shakespeare he's a Shakespeare specialist. And so first he recruited me to stay, and then we were talking about what I was going to do, and he's like, well, what I really think you should do is switch to Renaissance and work with me. And I was like, what? Like, Mike, I took one Renaissance course, and he was like, doesn't matter. Turns out it did. It did kind of matter. But what he said to me is like, sister, you already know enough about Tolkien to teach a class on him, and no one's ever going to ask you to do it, which, joke's on him. Then people did. But anyway, but he was right. I already knew enough about Tolkien to teach a class on him. And he's like, but everyone's always going to need a Shakespeare class. And I was like, also, that's true. And so then that's what I did. So then I did a couple more Renaissance classes before I was done with my coursework. And then I wrote a dissertation on Shakespeare. Which like, if you're going to, like, that's way more easy to out-nerd me on than Tolkien. Like,
I don't think either of us want to talk about our dissertations.
No, it's it's the worst.
Best left.
Right. Yeah.
But to bring it back.
Yes.
You have a pretty cool reading of what the points at which Tolkien and Shakespeare overlap, right?
Yes.
In spite of you said Tolkien saying rude things about them.
Okay. Indeed. Yes. And the key play here, everyone, is Macbeth. So if you could go to the next slide, actually. This is a famous line from Macbeth. Okay, so this is in a reference to one of the prophecies in Macbeth, right? There's a bunch of prophecies in Macbeth. There's the first set when we first meet Macbeth, and the witches tell him, "Hail, Macbeth, Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and who shall be king hereafter," right? And then he goes back to the witches later in the play, and he gets a second set of prophecies, "Beware Macduff." And then he gets this weird one about until Birnam Wood comes, no man of woman born shall harm Macbeth. That's the other one. And then till Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, like, you're good. I mean, that's a translation of, you know.
The no fear Shakespeare.
Yeah, that's right, yeah, and so we're good. And so this is what he says. He's like, oh my gosh, okay. So who can impress the force and bid the tree unfix his earthbound root? And you could click the slide one more time, I think. Tolkien is like, Ents can do that, man. So it's a couple slides forward, actually, I think, because this is Holinshed. You could skip that one. I can come back to it if we need it. We want the quote. Yeah, there we go. So he wrote this letter. I keep wanting to say the letter was to Walter Pater, which it so wasn't. It was to Auden. Okay, it was W.H. Auden. And he was just writing about the trilogy to Auden, who'd written a favorable review of the book. And this is in one of the notes when he was like talking about where did the Ents come from? And he was reflecting, he says, like philology, literature, and life. And he gives a philological explanation for where they came from. But the literature one is this, that when he says that his bitter disappointment and disgust from his school days with the shabby use made in Shakespeare of the coming of great Bertnamoyd to high Dunsinane Hill. And basically he just like longed to see a setting in which the trees would really march to war. He's like, yes, tree army, okay? And so his like unconscious or like felt desire that he needed a less, because what happens in the play, in case you don't know, is that the army cuts down tree branches from the forest to hide their numbers, and the forest looks like it's coming to the castle. This is all equivocation driven and about other things happening in Scotland at the time. But it's like a fake tree army. And so he just really felt like he wanted. And then Lord of the Rings, by the way, has two tree armies, kind of, because it got the Ents go to war against Isengard, but then also the Ents bring the Hjorns, or whatever we're calling them, how we pronounce that, like to Helm's Deep, right? And they just like, they wake up and there's a forest there and it's super creepy, and then it just eats everyone, and you're like, what the heck? And so he was just reflecting on like, where did this come from? And he's like, I think it just came from my disappointment with this moment in Macbeth. I think there might be another quote there from On Fairy Stories when he says something against him too. Okay, so then he goes back to Macbeth here when he's doing a whole thing about like why fantasy works in literature but not in drama, and it's related to kind of the way he thinks fantasy works and how you can't have secondary belief relative to drama. But note this ending thing, it's like, you just should have written a story, Shakespeare. And you're like, what? Okay, listen. So part of what's happening here is he's trying to say, don't judge my work, which at this point when he's writing the essay on fairy stories is just The Hobbit. Please don't judge it by the standards of drama. Drama is a different thing than imaginative literature. He's kind of to make a distinction there. And as he's saying, the witches like work in a storybook for some story ways, but when you see them on stage, okay, back to the secondary belief thing, you never think it's really a witch, right? Like, you know, it's Mrs. Jones from up the block, like dressed up as a witch today, being in the play. Like, you're never confused about that, right? Whereas in a story, you're like, ooh, I live in a world in which there's witches, you know? So he kind of goes after the witches specifically in Macbeth. So he knows that about the Ents. But what was the second prophecy Macbeth got in the third set of prophecies? I'm sorry, there's so many Macbeth prophecies.
Pop quiz.
No. Okay. Its first is beware Macduff. Then no man of woman born can kill Macbeth. So how is this prophecy fulfilled? Do you remember? Yeah.
C-section,
that's
maybe.
Macduff from his mother's womb untimely ripped. And you're like, that doesn't count?
Still a technicality, right?
Like, are you not of woman born? Like, I mean, what? But it didn't, I mean, like, anyway, it's technicality, right? And that's because, again, equivocation, that's a whole thing. But that's in the same way, like, I've always felt this about that prophecy, the way that Tolkien feels about the trees, like, it's lame. Like, that's a lame fulfillment of the prophecy. And so he doesn't say this, but what he did do, right? Okay, this is stuff in the appendix, so push up your glasses for this one. But in the appendix, you find out that the king of the Nazgul, right, it was prophesied that no man could kill him. Same thing. And then who does kill him?
Is it Arwen?
Is Éowyn? No, not Arwen. Because I have a whole thing about Arwen too. But
Started with a vowel.
Yeah, it's Éowyn and Mary, right? A hobbit stabs in the knee, and then Éowyn, in the movie it's like super dramatic when she takes off her helmet and she's like, "And I'm not a man," haha, you know. But that's a way better fulfillment of the prophecy, if I may say. Like, that's it's just like you did a better job, you know, Tolkien. So part of it is, I think what's unfair of Tolkien, right, is that this is stuff 100% lifted exactly from Shakespeare's source, which is Holinshed's Chronicles, in which he gives these exact prophecies, like almost word for word. So it's not like Shakespeare can just decide that I'm doing something different, you know, in some ways. Like, you can't just have a tree army when there's not one in the thing. Although he can apparently make Richard III, like, so much worse than he might have actually been in real life.
So a tree army would violate that secondary belief, right? Because there aren't tree armies.
There are no tree armies, right? Yeah. So that's like a known thing. There's like not like a famous, but like in the Tolkien nerddom land, there's like a classic article about these points and Macbeth, right? And so when I taught, as then I did do, jokes on you, Michael Mack, to seniors in high school, I taught a year-long Tolkien elective. I spent one whole quarter on a fairy stories because it's a dang hard text. But we were having a seminar because we did lecture tutorial seminars. So every third class was a seminar, and we're having a seminar on Macbeth, which is the play we read, because we had to read a Shakespeare play, and we were doing a Tolkien class. I'm like, well, obviously it's Macbeth. And one of my girls, Juliana Torres, sat back and she said, this is probably wrong, but do you think that Aragorn is like an anti-Macbeth? And it's one of those like great teaching moments. All of us were like, whoa. Like none of us have ever thought that before, but how could we not have thought it? Once she said it, it's so clear. That again, Tolkien doesn't say it, but like, yeah, Aragorn is an anti-Macbeth. So both of them, we hear about them before we see them, right? It's because we're setting up an expectations reality thing. So Macbeth, we just hear how awesome he is and how loyal he is and how much he's done against the fierce armies of Norway who were always showing up in Shakespeare plays. Well, explain that to me later, Father Jordan. I don't understand. Anyway, so, but then he like almost immediately kills King Duncan to become king. Okay, so Aragorn, we're like, what's Butterbur saying about him when he's in the corner? Like, I don't know about that Strider. He's pretty sketchy, and so we're getting this like subversion of expectations. Like we're like, oh, I don't know, this is scary, and then it turns out he's the best, right? And we're hearing about Macbeth that he's the best, and it turns out he's not, But both of them have these prophecies about how to be king. Because if you think that's like the best poem in the Lord of the Rings. No offense, Tolkien's great at lots of things, but like writing poetry, like slightly less great, But that's not all those who wander are lost. It's that one. The crownless again shall be king. There's this prophecy at the beginning about how he's going to be a king. And contrary to Macbeth, who goes home and tells his wife, and then she's like, great idea, let's kill King Duncan, you can be the king. That he's willing to wait. And that's why I was like, no, it can't be Arwen. Wasn't her. Okay, because she's, so if we're going to extend this a little bit, Arwen is anti-Lady Macbeth. Like, Lady Macbeth is the one who's like, you got to screw your courage to the sticking place and, like, man up and kill this king right now, and I'm going to help you. And Arwen, like, does nothing. She's, like, 100% off stage. And, like, at one point she's like, here is the banner of the king, which I have made thee. You know what I mean? Like, that's, like, all she does. But so she's not, and even though she knows, like, her dad isn't going to let her marry Aragorn unless he's the king of all Gondor, right? She's not, like, forcing him to do it. She's not being pushy about it. Like, they're absolutely just like waiting for things to take their course, to the point that Aragorn takes second fiddle to Frodo, for pity's sake. Like, he's just acting as a big diversion for the ring bearer. He knows he can't win this war that he's going to, and he's like, well, it's cool because we'll keep the eye over on us, and like Frodo can get the thing done. And there's also another part in Macbeth relevant here. When Aragorn's at the houses of healing, right? There's another prophecy about him, right? That the hands of the king shall be hands of healing. Ioreth, as the woman says, right? And then it turns out that's true, and he knows about the Ethelis, and like he cures people. Well, there's this like weird English interlude in Macbeth in which we're in England getting help to go fight against Macbeth, and they're talking about where's King Edward, and while he's out laying hands on people. This was a real English thing.
Isn't it for their goiters or something?
Scrofula.
Scrofulus, yeah.
Which this is like, I almost had a picture in the PowerPoint, and then it was like, nope. Nobody wants to look at that, actually.
It paints an imaginative picture, though.
It's a tuberculosis of the skin, yeah, so it's nice. But so it's known as the king's evil, and the king literally would lay his hands on people, or he would touch an angel coin, which then they would touch them. Like, their coins just had angels on them. Like, they had these gold coins with angels on them. They would touch it to themselves to be healed of this thing. And so that again, the like healing hands of the king thing is like, it's in English tradition, but it's also right there in Macbeth for Tolkien to like lift from.
I remember there's a very famous Cormac McCarthy quote about how books are made out of books. And
Yes.
It's natural, right, that Tolkien would be pulling in from the imaginative world that has been created in literary culture.
Yes. Yeah.
I want to ask one more sort of meaty question before I start passing this microphone around.
Cool.
So, again, coming back to Dominican sister, English PhD, how do you find that, because, so I was going to ask, like, did you feel a tension between this? Obviously not, since you were basically led into doing the one, because so how do you find the teaching of literature to be sort of like a playing out or expression of your vocation?
Oh yeah, it's so fun. First of all, um, and what I love about it is when you go into a theology class and sit down, like you sort of already know that you're there, and you can kind of check out. Like those students who want to check out have already checked out when they've sat down in a theology class. So in my class, there's a way in which like I have an opening to teach a lot of things about the world that I think are true, using Dante, for instance. I mean, that's easy. You're like, I'm just telling you what Dante thought. Happens to also be what I think. You know what I mean? But I'm just, this is what he said. And so in that way, I find that it's in some ways easier to get students to ask big questions about life in a literature class than it is in a theology class almost, if they're being forced to be there. So I teach in our core program at USC, and so it's like all the theo and the literature classes everybody's got to take. And so like, you're a nursing major, like you don't want to read the Odyssey. You know what I'm saying? But it turns out like you're actually so much gonna love the Odyssey because it's the best, And so, walking them through that and like why it's the best is because it's raising these big questions about life that you don't have answers to, or that are not made to be answered, like those kinds of questions. And so I think it's a quite evangelical opportunity for me in many ways to be kind of leading my students through these texts. Yeah.
So I can keep on going, but I want to share the microphone. Initial questions that a student has for Sister Maria Frassati. All right, I'm going to start wandering.
Hi.
Hi.
I was sort of wondering, what I've been hearing about, like, people converting to Catholicism through Lord of the Rings somehow.
Yeah.
And it seems like so beyond what, like, Tolkien would have expected from Lord of the Rings. I'm just wondering, like, what you think he would think of that phenomenon.
Oh, I mean, I think you'd think it's awesome, but also, I want to say like, use a word like sensible or something. Or it suits in this way. Recovery, escape, consolation. Consolation is about the happy ending, and I mean, although Frodo's happy ending ultimately has to happen off stage, right? Because he can't reassimilate into the world, and I think there's something true about that. But like, dang, that eucatastrophe is another one of his keywords. But the moment when they like wake up from finding the ring, right? And they, like, from having been rescued from Mount Doom, and then they're like, what are we doing? And they're like, put your old clothes on and like come before the king. And like Aragorn gets off the throne and like kneels down and says, praise him with great praise. I can almost not talk about it without crying, whoa, like the impact of that, right? But I think what the consolation of a happy ending tells us is this: we're inside a story. That's why I think this like story narrative thing is like, we're not standing outside like exercising our authority down here, but we're in a story ourselves. So sorry, my brain just jumps from one thing to the other. But so when Dante is, you're reading Dante and he's like, reader, consider. And you're like, whoa. And you have that, like, when you're reading along, you're like, I don't know, you knew I was here, and so there's a name for that in narrative studies. It's called metalepsis, when you like cross a narrative boundary like that. Tolkien doesn't do that. But what that does is sort of like if he's looking up out of the book at me, I'm kind of looking over my shoulder to who's writing the story that I'm in. So I think this super immersive world that Tolkien's created, that we come back from, like, we finished the book, and then it leads to this sort of question of like, I think I'm in a story that's being written, right, that has a happy ending. And so I think that's, I think he'd be surprised in one way, but in another, and pleased. I'm positive he'd be pleased. But I think it makes sense according to his like view of how he put things together that this would be happening. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Following up on the Catholic issue, I've been intrigued by the idea of Strider and Aragorn, right, as a kind of hidden king whose monarchy is made manifest. Yeah. And just to tie it back into Catholic private revelation or private prophecy, in Catholic private prophecy, again, one does not have to believe it, but there is a teaching that prior to the final crisis of the church with the rise of the Antichrist and the falling away from the Catholic Church, that there will be a great Catholic restoration, right? And that it will, that the world will be re-Catholicized culturally, economically, and politically, and that this will be affected by what is called the Great Monarch, right, who is a kind of hidden emperor, right, who is later made manifest, and he will kind of team up also with an angelic pope, okay, right? And I just wonder whether whether Tolkien was familiar with Catholic private prophecy and might have modeled Aragorn as a kind of hidden emperor, hidden Holy Roman Emperor who is really just an ordinary ranger at first and then becomes manifested as a great king, right? And also perhaps I just thought of this, but perhaps is Gandalf in a way a kind of holy angelic pope figure because he is in Tolkienian terms is a kind of religious figure,
right? And
anyway, I just throw that out for you. I don't know at all whether he was familiar with Catholic private prophecy on this.
Yeah, that I'm not sure. I am getting a Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World vibe from that, though. So then that was my next question, if Benson had read that. But that's a different question. I'm not sure.
So you were criticizing Lewis for just throwing things into his books before.
Right. Sorry, Father Isaiah.
You justify Tolkien and the eagles. He always has these eagles coming.
I know. Yeah, this is the famous Tolkienian dilemma. What are the eagles? Like he writes his characters in a corner, and then he's like, "Gotta send some eagles," And then there's all these memes of like, why didn't the eagles take the ring to Mount Doom? You know what I mean? Like if they could fly there, like what the heck? So, I don't know that I can justify him. I think he does talk about it. I'm having this vague memory of him talking about it in the letters, but I haven't brushed up on that occasionally. But in case you don't know, both in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there's several times when characters kind of get written into a corner and it's like, how are we going to get out? I'm going to send some eagles. And so sometimes if we're going super Catholic allegorical reading of things, this is like grace just got to come in and elevate nature.
So he had to resort to C.S. Lewis in order to...
But I think it's still, he's still sort of integrated them into the world in a way that made sense. It wasn't just boom, unicorns, Yeah.
So you mentioned Tolkien had that belief about art being a sub-creation.
Yeah.
The Dante with art,
yeah.
God's grandchild. Does that play any bit into his criticism of Lewis's own storytelling?
I think yes. That's what I'm saying. It's that I think Lewis had a much more casual view of things. And again, I like Gothic architecture. If I'm going to compare Lewis to Gothic architecture, I think there is something to Ruskin's point about the privileging of the individual imagination. But yeah, I do think that that's sort of what the deal is with their kind of imaginative split, as it were. Like Tolkien's got, he says good fantasy is driven by close understanding of the world as it actually is. He says if we don't know facts, we won't write fantasy. Okay, because he's like, it's not contrary to reason, it's supported by reason. And the more reasonable you are, the better fantasy you'll write, kind of. And so for him, it's about knowing that the world is ordered and having your secondary world reflect that order of the world most closely. And so when Lewis is just sort of and then Father Christmas is there, that. I think that sort of hit him the wrong way a little bit. I don't know if that's fair of Tolkien. I'm just trying to articulate Tolkien's point of view. Yeah.
So I know a lot more about C.S. Lewis than I do about Tolkien, but I'm going to defend. It's more a kind of question because it seems like the kind of the little bit I know about Tolkien and then what you kind of said, it seems like Lewis is more like, I'm going to use the term like philosophy first.
Yeah.
Like he's very into like, I'm going to build my world around like, I know you said it wasn't an allegory, but it is an allegory.
No, it's an allegory. I mean, he said it's not. I think it is.
Yeah, it is. But he was very like, I'm going to build this entire world around this philosophy.
Yes.
And like, I mean, I love all of his other, like, I'm kind of Chronicles of Narnia fan. Great Divorce is like just incredible.
I mean, Till We Have Faces is his best.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. As a literature teacher. Yeah.
Um,
I'm getting a nod, so I feel affirmed. Okay.
But yeah, like I guess is that a proper way to look at it, where it's like Lewis is a lot more kind of philosophy first, and
100%.
Tolkien's a lot more kind of like world.
Tolkien would say like things first. There's in this passage on fairy stories, he says like you can't say a lot about trees in a play, right? Like he's writing about concrete things, and he's like wood, stone, fire, bread, wine. Like he's sort of starting his story in these very incarnational things, and like then the stories sort of grow out of that, right? Like language that I'm making. Whereas Lewis, starts with an idea, and he's like, how can I incarnate this idea into a story? And which I just think is a quite different approach. It's not a bad approach. Like I don't mind an allegory, but I do think that it's quite different. Yeah.
I wonder if we could delve into the disturbing world of the Tolkien knockoff.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Good.
Because, if we think, well, stories come from stories, and see this really gripping stuff you're proposing, which was totally new to me, about him sort of like taking Macbeth and saying like, well, what if we did that
Yes.
better?
Sure. Yeah.
And sort of working all these things in. Now, of course, Macbeth is a great story, but then he makes himself a different kind of great story out of it. And then, the hot second The Hobbit is released, you get like Terry Brooks writes The Sword of Shannara, which is not The Hobbit, I swear. It's just Hobbit with big people. And it's like, oh my gosh. And then he writes like 38 novels, and they're terrible. And then like 30 seconds later, you've got, whatever, like David Eddings writes like 3 series. And then like in the 80s and 90s, you get, like the giant epic fantasy kind of tropes, like the whatever, Wheel of Time. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. And then you reach like end stage tragedy, rotting corpse situations with like George R.R. Martin and stuff like this. Where it's just like, oh my gosh, we got like magic, we got technology, we've got you. Oh, you wrote 2 languages. We have 17 languages, and like none of them work, but it's all great, and like whatever, because sex, and that's amazing. Anyway, Okay, so. I mean, in the end, it creates a genre. Like he creates a genre, and so anytime that anybody writes in this genre, they're doing a kind of
Tolkien fan fiction.
Tolkien fanfic.
Yeah.
Like anybody else.
Yeah. That's a good question. Like why is it derivative? Why am I like? A colleague was just criticizing me. For being too much of a romantic, as in the romantic movement, relative to Aeneid, which I don't like. Like I like Homer. Like I love Homer. And then you're like, Aeneid is the best fan fiction ever written, but like it's Homeric fan fiction. And he's like, well, why does everything have to be original, sister? And we're like, oh, I don't. Anyway, so that's one hang up is like Tolkien did so much. It's so big. It's such a big world that it's like difficult to engage it without just like doing what he did but worse. But I do think there's something also about the sweep of time in which Tolkien was thinking about it. Like he started writing this thing like when he's in his 20s, like in the trenches, like it's not coming to fruition until much later in his life when he's an established Oxford scholar of other things, right? And he's writing this book in his spare time while he has like a real job, like no offense to fantasy fiction writers, but like also that. And so, and then it's become an industry, like and a technique, right? Like the people are trying to study that how to make it reproducible. So I think all of that is not really answering the question, but is part of answering the question. Another reason I don't mind, like, I'm not a Tolkien purist, though. I will say, is that his thing, like his goal, right, was like, we want to have a mythology for England that's like English. I mean, in the same way that the Aeneid is like, we want to have a mythology for Rome that is Roman, okay? And so I think that sort of invites, and if he's saying that a secondary world is like we want this collaborative effort to happen, which he does say, then he and the Tolkien estate honestly should expect people to do things in Tolkien world or like Tolkien knockoff things, because he gave them the material. Like the Arthurian legends are all over the place, written by all kinds of people, because they're just sort of taking this stuff from the cauldron of story, Tolkien's going to call it, and using it to their own ends. And so I think that that's part of it. But part of it is like he'd used so many of the things in the cauldron of story that it's difficult. Like you pull a dwarf out of it, I'm like, well, you know what I mean? Like, you know, like, so there was so much and it was so original that it's difficult for anyone to be that original on that scale, I think, as he was. I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah.
Thank you so much. This is great. I have a question for you about that word. You just mentioned mythology, and we talked a lot about narrative and a lot about story. And it just struck me, just because we haven't mentioned that word myth, how important mythology was to Tolkien, because he was so steeped in it, especially like he loved the Norse myths, and that he was trying to show in a way that like by myth you can actually access like deeper truth. And I wondered if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, that other famous sections of On Fairy Stories that he wrote. So Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien was involved in Lewis's acceptance of theism. He had his conversion to Christianity like happened on a motorcycle with Warnie. Just like one day he started the trip, not a Christian. He ended the trip a Christian. But previously, when he was an avowed atheist non-believer, right? He and Tolkien and Hugo Dyson were on this walk around Magdalen College, Addison's Walk, and they were just having this long discussion about precisely this myth. And Lewis was like, myths are just lies breathed through silver. And Tolkien was like, whoa, man, you're doing this wrong. Okay, so that he's like, Christianity is a myth that actually is also true. And so that's like as the kind of primordial thing that's doing the myth sort of storytelling things that we do, and we do because we're made in God's image and God is a maker, right? God made us. And so in his image, and the only thing we know about him is that he made stuff, and so then we make stuff, right? And so he talks about like, yeah, you could make myths where you make false gods, and that's kind of lame, but that doesn't mean there's no good purpose for this kind of making that we do that reflects the creator's making. And so the sort of making that is done in accord with or in homage to or underneath the umbrella of the maker's making, I think those are the kind of myths that are good and true, either in the kind of capital T sense in which Christ really is a thing, that like he really came and he really did these things, or the kind of the small t truth of the like telling us the bigger truths of the world, and so the kind of more archetypal way. Yeah, does that help? Yeah.
I'm kind of staring at this quote about Macbeth, about Shakespeare. I'm kind of wondering if perhaps I'm reading into it a little bit too much, because it's in bold and it's right there on the screen. But
yes,
if Tolkien's kind of criticizing, or if Tolkien's saying that, you know, high fantasy enchantment is supposed to allow us to enter into this secondary world, and through that develop an awe for this world, see the order of this world, I'm wondering if he would acknowledge that, well, plays, narratives are not about that. They're about the characters. They're about understanding what it means to be a human being.
100%.
In this world. So that he would acknowledge.
You're just trying to say that they're different things. Yeah. Like, so fantasy, he's saying fantasy works so well in a novel, but like it doesn't work that well on stage. Because like, think of the play Cats. Like, this is adult people wearing cat suits. No one thinks that they're cats. You know what I'm saying? Like I can imagine a talking cat who's way less disturbing than an adult person in a cat suit. You know what I'm saying? So he's like, fantasy on stage is always a little bit cringe in that way. But he's just saying drama is precisely what he says is like it's about character, it's about different things than fantasy is about, which fantasy for him is primarily about things like stone, wood, fire.
So he's not lowering that as an art.
No, he's just saying that he's just trying to make a distinction between how they're different things. And then people basically also, all of the literary critics in England at the time that he's writing The Hobbit, like only know how to talk about drama or like have a bias towards talking about drama, which is like part of literature. And he's like, no, it's actually like a different thing. And if you come over to my book with the criteria by which you judge Shakespeare, like you're gonna hate my book. You know what I mean? So, but if I bring my criteria over to Shakespeare, we're gonna hate him too. So I think that's kind of the play that he's doing here. Yeah.
What about film? Like you mentioned
Yeah.
that Tolkien would view films differently. So one way to ask this question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would he hate the productions of Lord of the Rings that Peter Jackson did? Or you could take it more charitably and just talk me through how would he understand the sort of like imaginative possibilities that happen in film?
I do wonder, because, I mean, people did, fun fact, the Beatles asked to do an adaptation of Lord of the Rings. I'm not even making that up.
A musical adaptation?
Like, I don't know if it was musical or not, but they just really thought the Lord of the Rings was awesome and they wanted to do something about it. And he was like, no, like, ugh. So he wasn't, and then there was like that extremely horrible animated version of anyone? It's so bad. So he really did that. That was also a no. But I do wonder if, like he could have seen the films like with the kind of CGI technology, particularly the Lord of the Rings films before everything was all CGI-fied and like they were still doing practical effects stuff. When they made those films, if he would have approved at all. Like, I do think there's something about the way in which it can kind of create this immersive world. I do think where he would have a hesitation is like Gandalf is always going to look and sound like Sir Ian forever in my mind. You know what I mean? And whereas if I had not seen the movies, I might have created a Gandalf that's more suited to like how I would imagine Gandalf. You know what I mean? But now he's like forever and always like Sir Ian. Like that's like how he's going to look and sound. And so I think that Tolkien would probably prefer, because he's doing such priority of the imagination and the abilities to create fantasy, which, by the way, fantasy, I should say, he has a long passage where he explains like what it is, and it's based upon our ability to abstract essences from things, right? So the example that he gives is a green sun. Like, because I can look at a green thing and think of green in the abstract, and I can picture the sun even though I'm indoors without a window, and I can't look at the sun, I can put those two things together in my mind in a way that doesn't exist in real life. Like, I can build a Pegasus, you know what I mean, out of flight and horses. And that's what fantasy is. It's putting together things and recombining them in new ways. Why did I want to explain what fantasy was? I forget where I was even going with that. So special. It just felt important to what he's saying. Is the green sun in my slides? Question?
Yeah, you have it down.
Oh, I do have it in my slides. Look at that. I was like, I'm probably going to talk about the green sun because it feels important. So then that is all. But so I could show you a green sun on a stage, right? But I'm always going to like see the string. Like, I'm never going to think that the sun was green, you know, because I'm doing a different kind of contractual thing when I view a play or a movie. But I do wonder about the way that our movies are can be so immersive and believable. If he would have approved, best guess is no, because he's kind of a curmudgeon.
The way they shut down imaginative possibility, right? Because they give it to you. This is how it is.
Yes, like this is what the green sun looks like at the end. And so, whereas he's gonna like a thing that novels can do. My go-to example for this is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that she gives you like 4 things about what the monster looks like. He's tall, he's yellow-skinned, he has black hair,
watery eyes.
And then she tells you that like the nicest people ever, who she spends a lot of time telling us how nice these people are and how unusually good they are, immediately when they see him, they pick up stuff and start to beat him with it because he's that ugly. And so, like, how ugly is that? Like, if she told me how ugly it is, like, I'm not going to think it's that ugly sounding. But like when she sets it up, she just gives me a couple of things to hang my hat on, and then describes that he's so ugly that children pick up rocks and throw them at him immediately. then I imagine the ugliest thing that I can imagine, which might be different than the ugliest thing you can imagine. That's different than the ugliest thing Mary Shelley could imagine, right? So it sort of gives us that imaginative freedom that each of us gets the kind of best version of the thing for ourselves. Yeah.
So are there any questions that you really wish that somebody in the audience had asked and we just whiffed?
No, I don't know. I feel like those pretty good questions. I think that I had the Hollenshed text there, but I didn't think that was important. But I just think it's a fun. What I like about the Tolkien rewrites Shakespeare is like that you can sort of feel the dislike of Shakespeare built up by having been required to read him as an English schoolboy. You know what I mean? Which is what exactly happened to me with John Steinbeck. Like somebody sat me down and was like, "You got to read this book," and I was like, "Well, I hate John Steinbeck now." And like even as an adult with a PhD in English, I'm like, his prose is okay, but like, ugh. It's because somebody forced me to read it in school. And that's what happened with Tolkien and Shakespeare, really. But then this play that he hated, you know what I mean, that he's like resentful of having read, like shaped this whole imaginative world of his. So it like gives me hope as a teacher, you know what I mean? Like you might hate the Odyssey, but it'll do things to you later. Like, I don't know, like it's somehow consoling that even things that we don't like or that we fight against can be sort of foundational in our thought and things. So.
Know what to do when we ever stumble on Cyclops Island.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
In the underbelly of a sheep, right quick.
That's right.
So I guess then the last question is, so obviously one thing that's been exposed today is that my memory, my recollection of the Lord of the Rings isn't what it could be.
Okay.
But I do remember that hobbits love elevenses.
Yes.
Second breakfasts. So could you tell the assembled company with what enthusiasm hobbits would join us at the reception?
Oh, so much enthusiasm. They'd be all about a reception. Like, are you kidding?
So you heard it here. Please give a warm applause for Sister Mira Frassati.